Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Environment Forum. I'm Sarah Dimmick. I'm in the English department here. And I'm going to be very brief tonight because our wonderful postdoc from the Mahindra Center, Rebecca Hogue, will introduce our speaker. But I just want to say a huge thanks to Robin Kelsey, who co-organizes the Environment Forum with me, as well as Steve Beal and Mary McKinnon for putting tonight's event together. And with that, please welcome Rebecca.
Aloha mai kākou. Glad to hear there are some people from Hawaii here in the audience today. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Rebecca Hogue. Here at Harvard, I am a postdoctoral fellow at the Mahindra Humanities Center, as Sarah so wonderfully said. I am also fortunate to be someone raised on Kanaka Ōiwi lands in the moku of Koʻolau poʻo, on the island of Oʻahu in the Pai'aina of Hawaii. And Hawaii, I want to make clear, is currently under its 131st year of illegal military occupation by the United States. And this is a fact that we should not forget. But today, it is my profound honor to welcome you to tonight's event and to introduce my beloved friend, Professor Hiʻilei Julia Kawehipua'akahaupulani Hobart. We are gathered here this evening in native space. Harvard University is located in the traditional and ancestral land of the Massachusetts, the original inhabitants of what is now known as Boston and Cambridge. We pay our respect to the people of the Massachusetts tribe, past, present, and emergent, and honor the land itself, which remains sacred to the Massachusetts people. Honoring stories of land is particularly germane to Professor Hobart's talk this evening. For the past several years here at Harvard, I have had the great privilege of teaching with Professor Hobart's work on the relationships between land and oceans, on climate change and indigenous sovereignty. Students from all over the world are moved by her creativity, her rich archival research, the poignancy of her arguments, and most often, the beauty and the power of her writing. Professor Hobart is an assistant professor of Native and Indigenous Studies at Yale. In her already extraordinary career, Professor Hobart has demonstrated herself as a leading scholar across the disciplines of Indigenous studies, food studies, American studies, and so much more. She is the editor of several special collections, including Radical Care, Foodways of Hawaii, and the highly anticipated forthcoming issue of American Quarterly, We Are Not American Still. She is a generous, rigorous, and capacious thinker informed by her truly interdisciplinary training with a PhD in food studies and her not one, but two master's degrees in decorative arts, design, and culture, and rare books librarianship and archives management. It is no wonder then that this gorgeous book of hers, Cooling the Tropics, Ice, Indigeneity, and Hawaiian Refreshment from Duke University Press in 2022, was winner of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association Best First Book Prize, is not only so pretty on the outside, but filled with elegant prose and compelling storytelling. In it, we read her acts of capacious translation, not just in translating one language from another, ʻōlelo Hawaii to English, but making legible the stories of advertisements, applications for business licenses, newspapers, photographs, and restaurant menus. Her book honors Hawaii's diverse native ecosystems, their wahipana, their legendary places, the moʻolelo, the stories, the histories that belong to them. Professor Hobart beautifully weaves the hyperlocal and the global flows of ice and the cold with attention to their moves, shifts, and impacts, how Kanaka Maoli maintained indigenous understandings of the cold and climate despite the dramatic changes to the archipelago in the 19th century, and ultimately how Kanaka Maoli lifeways persist amidst the ever-growing onslaught of militarism, tourism, and settler scientific development. These political stakes of ongoing Hawaiian knowledge, whether at home or in diaspora, which we will hear more about in her beautiful presentation today, highlight the urgency, the necessity of Professor Hobart's work for Hawaii, for Indigenous studies and anti-imperial scholarship, for all of us. Mahalo piha e hoa for being here today. We are so lucky to share space with you. So we will soon welcome Professor Hobart to the podium. But first, it is my honor and a surprise to Professor Hobart to introduce you to several of our students from our Harvard Hawaii Club, all Kanaka Maoli students from the island of Oʻahu. They have a special welcome for Professor Hobart, so please join me in welcoming Kiani Akina, Ka'eo Kekumano, Ali Cook, and Kainoa Paul.
Aloha mai kako. That was the most beautiful introduction I have ever received. I'm so honored by your gifts. Thank you for coming. Mahalo nui. Thank you to Sarah Dimmick for inviting me. Thank you, Rebecca, for gifting me with that introduction. Thank you, Mary McKinnon, for making all the arrangements for it to be possible for me to be here. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to present some new work. It's work that is very meaningful to me. And I'm going to jump right in. I've got a little bit of a sniffle, so apologies. In February 2020, a group of Kanaka Ōiwi cultural practitioners arrived in Cambridge, England, to bring home ancestors stolen from Hawaii in the late 19th century. Representing the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, or OHA, the group was led by Edward Halealoha Ayau, a repatriation specialist who has been a practitioner of Ma'alama Kupuna, or the care of ancestral bones, for over 30 years, and here you can see him pictured in an embrace. In this instance, the remains were comprised of 20 iwi poʻo, or skulls, held by the Duckworth Laboratory, one of the world's largest repositories of human and primate remains, which is housed in the University of Cambridge's Department of Archaeology. Video footage of the repatriation ceremony shows Vice Chancellor Stephen J. Toop apologizing, saying, "To your kupuna, I say I am sorry that your journey home has been so long interrupted, but I hope that you may now travel back in peace." The grief-stricken delegation, donned in funerary attire, responded by reciting oli or chants and gifting their host with mailele, gracious despite the violent circumstances under which they gathered. While the iwi poʻo being returned originated from a number of sites in Hawaii, the majority had been taken from the foot of the Pali, which is an important mountain pass and historic battle site in the Koʻolau mountain range that bounds the western edge of Oʻahu's windward side. This talk focuses on the ancestors that were taken from this particular site, chronicling their possession and return in order to explore possible interpretations of haunting beyond settler colonial horror. These once possessed iwi poʻo, I will go on to describe, did some possessing of their own as their journey back to Hawaii unfolded, and in doing so, they offer important lessons on the indelibility of Indigenous past despite settler encroachments, as well as the continued importance and urgency of Hawaiian cultural geographies beyond territorial dispossession. And so today, I want to tell a story about possession, what it means to possess, to be possessed, and to dispossess, drawing on current literatures emerging out of the fields of Indigenous studies and Black studies that employ haunting as a conceptual framework for understanding the phenomenological weight of settler colonialism and racial capitalism. Building on these insightful interventions, I want to offer a grounded analysis of one such haunting in order to translate these theories into an Ōiwi context. In brief, I argue that Indigenous ghosts, while often deployed as a narrative tool to describe the grievances of dismembered communities, can and do exist beyond those histories. I come to this analysis from my own recent experience in working with ancestral remains. Not long after I initially interviewed Ayau and his students for this project, their names Mana and Kalehua Caceres, about the Cambridge repatriation, I learned of iwi held by the Peabody Museum at Yale University, where I currently teach. Not trained to do such work, I learned quickly via Zoom. The Cacereses taught me and other Kanaka Ōiwi students and I the chants and protocols required to appropriately conduct ceremony as we work to return those ancestors to Hawaii in October 2022. And that experience, which I recently published about as a personal essay, compels my desires to recuperate the beauty of ancestral communion and longing to return home. I'm gonna get a tissue. Against haunting. I contend that the concept of haunting is too limited for this analysis I give here, though it is a good place to start. One of the most important texts on the topic is Avery Gordon's Ghostly Matters, which argues that haunting is part of the sociological imagination. It's the thing that allows us to acknowledge the parts of life that are, quote, barely visible, yet felt beyond concrete knowing. Building on Gordon's work, geographers Aisha Best and Margaret Ramirez have recently described haunting as, quote, a mode of refusing displacement, banishment, and archival erasure of Black life that staunchly refutes sanitized and whitened futures. Taking full stock of the horrors that produced the US, it is easy to understand why the unfinished business of settler colonialism is so readily theorized through the apparitional or the uncanny. Eve Tuck and C. Ree, who are also widely cited on the matter, liken settler colonialism to the literary and filmic genre of horror, in which ghosts become the, quote, relentless remembering and reminding of genocidal violence and subjugation. The relationship between ghosts and the people and places they haunt then hinge on histories of dispossession. I'm drawing this point out just a little more. Literatures on Native ghosts and hauntings importantly reveal how Indigenous pasts are residually maintained by settler society. They narrate conquest. But the narrative device of the Indigenous ghost as a form of settler horror tells us equally about the conquest as a failed project. In Hawaii, ghost stories are often used to illustrate the grief bound up in its political history. The spirits of Hawaiian ali'i are, for example, known to inhabit historic hotels and royal residences as a reminder of a lost national sovereignty. The presence of huaka'i poʻo, also known as the night marchers, often signify a primordial past, fearsome but easily allayed, that is incongruent with a civilized, westernized present. In these ways, Hawaiian histories and culture ornament the triumphal success of the American state, even though, as Stephanie Nohelani Teves points out, stories and images of a spectral Hawaiian kingdom paradoxically reflect niggling anxieties around the illegitimacy of U.S. occupation and the always incomplete project of Indigenous elimination. Teves notes that, quote, "For Kanaka Maoli, the kingdom is so close that we have family who remember it," suggesting the ways that haunting and mourning collapse the personal and political landscapes of dispossession into one another. While useful, these theorizations of haunting simultaneously remain so bound to the horror of dispossession that the spirits themselves are often overlooked. What I'm suggesting here is that while haunting is useful for conceptually teasing out the messiness of power, as Gordon puts it, life is complicated, it must be tailored if we are to understand a people, a place, and their spirits apart from the abstracted asymmetries of power. Native Hawaiian concepts of haunting offer more complete and precise formulations that do not require the trauma of colonization for its expression. In ʻōlelo Hawaii, there are several terms, each with their own valences that refer to ghostly haunting, including noho, or, I tried to be fancy, including noho, possession of a medium by a spirit or god, possessed, to possess, uhane, spirit or ghost, lapu, apparition, phantom, specter, haunted, to haunt. Here I favor hoʻopahulu as a term for haunting. While perhaps less popular than some of the other words listed here, I believe that it resonates especially with the context of repatriation and reburial of bones. As a term, it is also used to describe soil that has been exhausted from overfarming, thus connecting spectrality and agricultural labor through paradigms of imbalance. Calling our attention to the connections between land and spirit, then, hoʻopahulu invites us to think about hauntings that exceed colonial geographies. Not only does this word reflect the nightmarish conditions under which the theft of ancestral remains occurs, it also refers to the kaumaha, or grief, and inaina, or rage, that the kupuna may feel about their situation. While a full accounting of the concept of hoʻopahulu is beyond the scope of this talk, I offer this brief overview as context for thinking about the circumstances surrounding the return of 14 iwi poʻo to the Pali State Wayside Park in the summer of 2021, when these ancestors made their desires to return home clear to those who assisted in their repatriation. This is not a ghost story, though one might be tempted to tell it as such. Rather, I want to present it as an analysis of ʻōiwi, a word that literally translates to of bone, ʻōiwi memory and memorialization that is both very much of the present and deeply grounded in our histories of place. The place of this story, specifically, is a mountain passage on the island of Oʻahu, Hawaii Route 61, also known as the Pali Highway, and its conjoined park, Nu'uanu Pali State Wayside, a scenic lookout fashioned out of a section of the old road that used to go through the mountain pass. The location, along with the valley to which it belongs, Nu'uanu, is named for its height and its bracingly cold air. Anu translates to cold, and Nu'u describes a summit, and if you've been there, you'll know that it was named appropriately. The cliffs are so sheer and so tall that it makes the wind send waterfalls flowing upward, defying gravity. The Pali Lookout, the name by which most refer to the Pali State Wayside Park, is one of Hawaii's paradigmatic examples of what Bernadette Gonzalez calls the scenic sublime, a sentiment produced by colonial tunnel highways in which precipices and expansive views inspire feelings of divine territorial command. Since the 1850s, it has been popularly photographed by generations of locals and tourists, and in turn, the trajectory of its development well documented. First a footpath and horse trail until the 1840s, then a cobblestoned buggy road until the 1890s, next a motorway until, in the mid-20th century, it was superseded by the Nu'uanu Pali tunnels drilled into the mountain below. Once cleared of through traffic, the paved road that curved through the gap, which you can kind of see here and you'll see more of, better accommodated a lingering visitor. In the decades after Hawaii's admission as a U.S. state in 1959, newly available federal funds helped to usher in an era of tourism and militarization of the islands. Anticipating population and economic increases across those first few and fervent decades, the local government focused on readying major thoroughfares and recreational facilities for an influx of American transplants and pleasure seekers. And because they often sat in the pathway of such rapid development, many Native Hawaiian heiau and burial sites were disturbed or destroyed as a result. And so the mid-century expansion of Oahu's parks and road systems can also be read as a story of their hauntings. Though there are many examples of haunted infrastructure projects in Hawaii, one of the most notable examples of spectral retaliation is during the construction of the H3 interstate highway. Completed in 1997, it would become one of three that now run through the Koʻolau range. While not a park per se, the highway was designed to double as a corridor between American military bases and as a tourist attraction that could, quote, in the words of developers, aid in the implementation of Hawaii's recreation program. Taking 37 years and $1.3 billion to complete, the project was famously besieged with construction accidents and inexplicable phenomenon, which the public attributed to the initial siting of the road through the historically significant Hālava Valley, which is the home to the important women's heiau Haleʻopapa. Although the highway was eventually rerouted after sustained community protest, unease about the road remains prominent in stories that are told and retold about its making. One of my aunties wouldn't drive the highway for years after it opened, not until she saw enough Hawaiians cross it with safe passage. Although the construction of the Pali Highway predates the H3 by decades, its making was just as troubled by apparitions, strange occurrences, and colonial infrastructural failures, causing many to be superstitious about the road. And really, anyone who grew up on Oahu would warn you that you shouldn't go through the mountain pass with uncooked pork on your car on account of Pele's long-standing grudge against Kamopua'a, and tell you that you might be on the lookout for other apparitions too. On a December afternoon in 2022, I casually surveyed family members as we potlucked in my cousin's backyard. Auntie Banks had a story about very nearly running into the big white dog the size of a cow that lives by the cemetery in Lower Nu'uanu during a nightmare downpour. My cousin Kaula saw the old woman walking on the side of the Pali Highway one night as he drove his friends home after a night of partying in Honolulu, her ghostly appearance shocking him into getting everybody back safe. And every Oahu family has plenty of these stories to tell. And while these stories could be dismissed as kind of chicken skin colloquialisms, I think they can also be interpreted as everyday forms of remembering a pre-colonial Hawaii. And so I'm compelled to suggest some revision to the language used to describe these events, one that does not relegate them to affective regimes of settler colonial horror in the way that Native ghosts often are, but recognizes them instead as part of a living landscape that predates Western encroachments. The section of the range through which the Pali Highway runs is deeply significant to the formation of Native Hawaiian political and cultural subjecthood. In addition to being the site of a number of important heiau, including Waolani and mo'olelo such as Keaomelemele, the Pali Gap is also where the historic Battle of Nu'uanu reached its climax, solidifying Kamehameha's rule over the majority of the Hawaiian archipelago in 1795. And this is a very famous painting by a Native Hawaiian painter named Herb Kane that most people would recognize as an illustration of the Battle of Nu'uanu. There, Kamehameha defeated an army led by Kalanikapule, the ali'i nui of Oʻahu and Maui Islands, by driving hundreds of warriors up through the cradle of the valley and eventually to the precipice of the cliff where they were pushed or chose to leap to their deaths. This history is complex and really shouldn't be sanitized. The unification of Hawaii under Kamehameha's rule involved brutal conflict that Kanaka Maoli continue to grapple with and memorialize today. The Pali's political significance is rivaled by its economic significance for Oahu's colonial development across the 20th century. Historian Don E. Dunsing argues that even since the time of the Hawaiian Kingdom's constitutional government, it was haole missionary or foreign missionaries and business elites who aggressively pushed for road development in order to unlock the economic potential of Oahu's agricultural, tourism, and military sectors. Like many of the infrastructure projects that penetrated deep into the inland valleys of the island at the time, the Pali Road evolved tediously as politicians and engineers struggled to make the gap reliably passable. They just couldn't get the roads to stick to the side of the mountain. It's quite a wild romp through the archives about that. Throughout the 19th century, the kingdom's Minister of the Interior frequently complained about the expense required for upkeep, frustrated by the sheer grade of the Koʻolau ridges, failing bridges and unpaved roads easily washed away in heavy rains, cutting off the quickest connection to windward communities and their farms. As the passage incrementally improved, Oahu tourist itineraries began to include a trip over the Pali to admire the windward side. Travelogues of the time comment on the, quote, furious wind threatening to sweep everything before it, as much as they did the awe-inspiring view from the gap. Some of these travelers also remarked on the uncanny combination of transcendence and horror they felt when they looked down on their descent to the district of Koʻolau Poko, only to see the remains of Kalaniʻupule's warriors still lying at the base of the mountain where they had fallen 100 years prior. In 1873, for example, British travelogue writer Isabella Lucy Bird wrote about how noticing the bones bleaching 800 feet below the precipice as she traveled the mountain road. Another writer, Anne M. Prescott, suggested that this was actually a good site for tourists to help themselves to the remains as travel souvenirs, reporting in 1893 that, quote, bones can still be found here if one has such an aloha for such grave relics and mortal curios. Blithe notes such as these dehumanized Hawaiians, certainly. Importantly, they also convey how common it was at the time for visitors to thieve ancestral remains as casually as one might pick up a snow globe for their collections back home. Tourist observations of the visible iwi would be echoed by construction workers who dynamited ledges for the new road into the cliffside during the 1890s. Robert Krause, biographer of Hawaii highway engineer John Wilson, who's photographed here, writes that, quote, Johnny said that he found 800 skulls and the bones of defeated warriors thrown over the cliff during the battle, still moldering at the bottom before rock blasted from the cliffs obliterated this historic natural cemetery. And so while that era of roadwork destroyed the informal graveyard at the base of the mountain, it also ended the looting of iwi from that site, burying what was left under hundreds of tons of rocks from above. Not uncoincidentally, the construction of the old highway significantly connects to the repatriation in 2020, genealogically as well as geographically. Edward Halealoha Ayau, the cultural practitioner with whom I opened this talk, is a descendant of Wilson, who ordered the dynamiting of the Pali for road construction. In fact, if it were not for the theft of the iwi poʻo sometime in the mid-1890s, they would have simply been crushed under the rubble with the other remains from the battle. Aiao, then, seemed strangely destined to facilitate their return. After 28 years of consultation, OHA, the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, submitted a repatriation claim in January of 2019 to the University of Cambridge, which detailed extensive research tracing the origins of 20 iwi kupuna to the island of Oʻahu, including the 14 from the Pali. This repatriation, and many like it that have returned to Hawaii from international repositories, was resolved in accordance with the procedures set out by the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA, despite the act being formally restricted to U.S. jurisdictions. Citing both Hawaiian values of pono, or balance, justice, and righteousness, and legal precedent through an 1860 Hawaiian Kingdom penal law that prohibited the removal of disinterment of human remains, OHA's claim asserts the cultural importance of return and reburial for Hawaiians. In it, the writers methodically lay out decades of deception by the University of Cambridge, evidenced by internal communication between faculty members who chose not to disclose the holdings of the Duckworth Laboratories when queried by the State of Hawaii's Department of Land and Natural Resources in 1990. We never thought twice about their response, Aiao told me, but in talking with other Indigenous people in the network, they said, no, you probably want to circle back to Cambridge at some point because they have the second largest collection in the UK. Believing that Cambridge had no iwi in their collections, queries would cease until 2012, when one of Aiao's colleagues sent him a link from the institution's newly online catalog, showing entries for 2 skulls with Hawaiian origins in the Duckworth Human Osteological Collection. It would take another couple of years for the director of the laboratory, Dr. Marta Lahr, to agree to a morphological analysis to be conducted on those skulls, plus the additional 19 that had been located with catalog information pertinent to Hawaii. The analysis they produced was based on craniometrics, a method of determining ancestry widely recognized for its problematic origins and production of inconclusive results. Lahr would use craniometrics for this very reason, suggesting that, quote, biological ethnic affinity based on cranial shape is impossible, despite also recognizing that the specific form of cranial deformation exhibited by these skulls correlated with a known Native Hawaiian cultural practice contemporary to these individuals. Cambridge researchers, loath to concede the origins of the bones, upheld inconclusive test results as definitive despite mounting archival evidence, including the Duckworth's own metadata, that confirmed otherwise. More years would go by, during which external experts would also conclude that the remains were in fact Native Hawaiian, despite repeated maneuvers to deny them as such. The collection in question contained iwi from 3 separate donor lots, though the majority, the remains of 17 individuals, were donated by British ornithologist named R.C.L. Perkins. He was a bird guy. Of those 17, 3 were deposited in 1894. They are listed in the catalog as originating from Burying Place, Oʻahu. The rest came to the university in 1902 to 1903. These, according to an interview between a biographer and Perkins's grandson, were taken from the base of the Nu'uanu Pali. The 14 skulls in the second series are also significant in that they all exhibited the aforementioned cranial deformation. And this was the result of a traditional practice of head wrapping during the infancy of high-ranking individuals, which was likely a criteria that Perkins used to select specimens. What he may not have known, but what 21st century tests would show, is that about half of those skulls are female. Perkins was in Hawaii to work for the Sandwich Islands Committee, a group convened by the British Association for the Advancement of Science, which was a committee that sought to fill in any deficiencies in knowledge the association had about the environments of Oceania. Between 1892 and 1901, Perkins traveled back and forth to Hawaii several times to study its plants, eventually publishing his findings in a book entitled Fauna Hawaiiensis, which is still a commonly used text in terms of bird ornithology in Hawaii today. After this project's completion, he remained in Hawaii, working first for the Agricultural Department of the Hawaiian Islands and later as the director of the Hawaiian Sugar Plantation Association's Insect Department. He wouldn't return to England again in 1909. Perkins, of course, had no business collecting people, despite helping himself to, quote, many skulls at the base of the Pali, that he would eventually donate. And this means that Perkins would have done his collecting between 1892 and 1897, maybe 1898, when the Pali Road was being built. Perkins, unsurprisingly, failed to document consent from the families of these deceased for their removal, which consequently also prevented the University of Cambridge from being able to claim legitimate ownership and possession. The question of possession, which animates a lot of the literature on NAGPRA more generally, and on this case specifically, exceeds the reams of paperwork that painstakingly detail claims against British ownership of these remains, traced through a chain of theft and acquisition across several centuries. And so it's useful now, I think, to trouble possession a bit, even as we might also trace the contours of theft. Ayao's career in repatriation work is distinguished by his refusal to recognize the institutional ownership of Hawaiian remains. In 2005, his group Hui Mā Lama I Nā Kupuna'o Hawaii Nei removed 83 artifacts from the Bishop Museum in Honolulu and returned them to caves on Hawaii Island, from which they were looted in 1905. He was later jailed for not revealing their precise location to a district court judge. A refusal to divulge the location of ancestors is also a refusal of their cataloging, collating, and categorization as museum artifacts. It became clear to Ayao across the decade or so that he worked on the Duckworth claim that the iwi themselves refused to be possessed, and so insisted on their return to Hawaii using all avenues available to them. As Ayao told it to me, these particular avenues started with stomach cramps that came on debilitatingly fast. Soon, he was so doubled over in pain that he nearly asked his wife one evening to take him to the hospital. But on that particular night, her cousin happened to be in town, and this unplanned family obligation kept him home in agony, entertaining instead. That night they sat in conversation for a while, until, abruptly, the cousin's demeanor shifted. He turned and locked eyes with Ayao and said, in a strange voice, "Why have you forsaken us? Why aren't you helping to get us home?" The cousin lifted his arm and pointed to the door that led into Ayao's home office. "What I'm talking about is in that room." And this cousin is known to be gifted with ike pāpālua, a kind of second sight. And whether he knew it at the time or not, he pointed to where Ayao keeps his international repatriation files. Sitting there on the top of the pile was the Duckworth folder. And as Ayao started to figure out what was going on, the pain lifted as quickly as it came on. What that alerted me to, he told me, was that there were some very powerful personalities amongst those kupuna. By the time Ayao went with the Oha delegation to England, his relationship with these wahine koa, or women warriors, was quite intimate, and preparations for their appropriate reception back on Oʻahu were fully underway. The iwi poʻo would be brought back to the Pali, though the site of their return looked very different from the time they had fought in the battle in 1795. Today, visitors going there can pull off the highway and park their cars for a fee while they walk out onto the viewing platform you see here to admire the grand sweep of the windward side as it unfurls beneath them. The parched hills of Kailua and its turquoise waters beyond, the deep greens of Kaneohe that foreground the district of Koʻolau Loa as it stretches north, sandwiched between the sheer mountains and the placid sea, the suburban sprawl of houses held at bay by inland golf courses. As the visitor walks out to the edge of the platform, a plain, angular concrete space designed to draw your eye outward, you can feel the traffic whipping through the tunnels below your feet. To the left, a sharp, solitary peak that juts up in the uncanny shape of an incisor tooth goes in one direction. To the right, a large iron gate blocks off the curve of the now crumbling old road as it descends into the valley. Tourists spend about an average of 10 minutes taking in the view before getting back in their vehicle and continuing the drive across the mountain, though some stay for longer in order to scurry up one of the unsanctioned hiking trails that leads higher up into the range. On the platform, some interpretive signing exists so that people might reflect on the historical significance of the site, though most people just go for the view. Plaques embedded into the rock walls of the platform help commemorate things like territorial highway construction, World War II military surveillance casualties, and hang gliding records, which collectively mirror the colonial economies of development, war, and leisure that have done so much work to cement American dominance in the islands. An angle-mounted interpretive sign also contextualizes the site's deeper significance in Hawaiian history, illustrating the Battle of Nu'uanu with a replication of that Herb Kane painting, illustrating the warriors at the moment of their defeat, clutching at the air as they free fall into the clouds below. But mostly, the park, literally a look out, does not call attention to itself or the Hawaiian cultural geographies that are currently being remade within. In the winter of 2020, the iwi poʻo returned to the Pali during a midnight reinterment ceremony, organized by Aiao after the park closed to the public, with a small group of cultural practitioners also trained in Mālama iwi kupuna. When I asked Aiao what it felt like to return ancestors home, he used the language of replanting to describe the process of returning them to poʻo or darkness, invoking the double meaning of hoʻopahulu, and hinting at the idea that as the anger of the spirits are quieted, the soil too becomes replenished. In this case, correctly replanting the iwi required paying close attention to what those particular ancestors might want, including intentionally selecting a reburial site within the park that was set back from the precipice, rather than at the base of the cliff from where they originally were removed. Recognizing that the theft of the bones to Cambridge was not the only trauma inflicted on these ancestors, but in fact compounded the violence experienced in and after battle, those handling the iwi poʻo on the evening of the reburial took care not to recapitulate grief bound up in those moments. Instead, as they walked the bones from the parking lot toward the burial site, the gaze of the poʻo would be oriented toward Nu'uanu Valley. And as they arrived at their new resting place, members of the group performed a hula for Kawaialele o Nu'uanu, a mele or songs about the waterfalls that flow upward, so that the beauty of the valley would, quote, be the last thing they saw before we covered them. These details reflect the important role that intimate knowledges of history and place play in proper Mālama iwi. Anticipating the desires of these ancestors also serve as foundational touchstones for remembering Native Hawaiian cultural and political sovereignty. These forms of remembering also included awareness of the specific relationship between the kupuna, the environment, and the people conducting the ceremony. Aiao explained that the ceremony diverged from traditional formats because, as he said, I could sense it wasn't tension, or like they were trying to do what they did to me at my house, but they were making it very clear to me that they wanted a wahine or a woman to preside over their reburial. an unusual divergence from traditional protocols that have kane or men officiating these types of ceremonies, Kalehua Caceres, a student of Aiao, instead took on the role of alaka'i, or leader. When I asked her about the experience, she focused on the sense of peace that settled over the space as the ceremony concluded, explaining that, quote, even though it was about 1 o'clock in the morning, everything was peaceful. And my experience up there has always been, and I know the wind you're talking about, the poʻo mahina was out and it was past the cliff that's right there, and there was no wind. Aiao similarly described how the moon was out that night, and so they anxiously stayed in the shadow of the clouds and the mountain in order to keep the iwi in poʻo, or darkness. I swear the clouds just stayed, he said. And as soon as we covered them up, then the clouds finally moved and the place just lit up. It's like they were able to hold the clouds long enough to be protected by darkness all the way until we put them down. These recollections point to the limitations embedded within concepts like haunting. What does it look like to relinquish possession rather than repossess? Without possession, without horror, the reburial ceremony created a space for careful listening to an environment that could convey peace at last. I'm almost done, I promise. Last summer, I returned once more to the Pali Lookout to participate in a dry masonry workshop led by a team of Kanaka Ōiwi stonemasons who had flown to Oʻahu from a neighbor island to build an ahu, or a platform for the iwi kupuna. This is Hale Aloha with the stonemasons. This large stone platform they would cap off and mark the burial site, which had, for about a year since, gone unmarked within the park. It had taken that long, at least, to get the plans for the project approved and its construction funded. The process and politics of Hawaiian memory and memorialization required tedious navigation through colonial systems of governance over space deemed public. Even determining the reburial site required bureaucratic negotiation between several entities, including Native Hawaiian cultural practitioners, the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, the State of Hawaii's State Parks Division of DLNR, and the State Highways Division of the Department of Transportation, as well as spatial planning that worked with the needs of the iwi kupuna, as well as the daily foot traffic within the park. So the ahu now helps to block the illegal trailheads that go further up the mountain. The stonemasons who built the ahu are practitioners with increasingly rare expertise, having mastered traditional building techniques appropriate to the task of memorializing the dead. Under their tutelage, our workshop group learned about how to select rocks that would nestle into each other and not budge, an unexpectedly tender practice. We memorized the chants for asking stones their permission to be used and how to recognize when that permission isn't granted. The process was careful and heavy and sweet. My presence at the workshop hadn't been planned. In fact, I only found out about it a couple of days before it happened, but it felt like many other moments in the time that I have been writing about these kupuna that we are having more than chance meetings with one another. Now visiting the Pali Lookout entails a walk past our kupuna at rest, and their story etched in ʻōlelo Hawaii and English, which reads, in honor of their bravery, skill, and commitment of Hawaiian warrior women who fought and died in the Battle of Nu'uanu in 1795, whose bones were then looted by RCL Perkins in 1894 and illegally removed and taken to Cambridge University in England and thereafter repatriated and reburied more than a century later. We shall never forget your sacrifice, and will forever honor your courage with this reburial platform, fondly known as Hale Aloha Hale Mau. As we illuminate our past, let the light of aloha shine through to guide our future. The bones live. To conclude my time with you here this evening, I want to suggest in sum that settler colonial possession fails in its application despite the violence that it wields. Like the story of Hawaii's dispossession, we believe in haunted landscapes because narrative repetition makes it seem so. But that is not our story. In her landmark essay From a Native Daughter, Honenike Trask chafes against Western narratives about, quote, pagan Hawaiians, describing how over time she grew conscious of how foreign historians use these to narrate their dominance under the guise of historical fact. Quote, when they wrote that Hawaiians were primitive in their grief over the passing of loved ones, Trask argues, they meant that the West grieves for the living who do not walk amongst their ancestors. Walking among kin, then, becomes a crucial element of Kanaka Maoli identity that grounds ancestral relationships in the present rather than a repressed and traumatic past. Carrying this profound insight forward in a volume of collected essays on Indigenous resurgence, Noelani Goodyear Kaopua recalls asking her grandmother as a child to promise never to visit her in spirit form after she dies. Goodyear Kaopua writes, today, there is no request that I regret more in my life than this thing that I asked. What forms of colonial violence have we Hawaiians been subjected to that we would beg our spirits to quietly disappear from our waking worlds? In contrast to state-sanctioned performances that simultaneously commemorate and domesticate the Hawaiian kingdom, the ceremony at the Pali lookout created a space for memorialization that was not set out for public approval, or the narrativization of settler colonialism. Returning our ancestors home, then, invites us to enact a different kind of intimacy to place that reminds us of who we come from and where we can return to. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for that incredible talk. I hear talks often, and I am rarely as moved as by that one. Yes. Rebecca and I have so many questions, and we could ask you questions for the next hour, but we want to make sure that everyone here tonight who has a question for Hi'i has a chance to ask. So we are going to open the floor. Please feel free to and please use the microphone when you ask your question, because it is being recorded, so that helps with the recording. So the microphone is available. Please feel free to raise your hand.
Yes.
Thank you so much. I am so moved. And this isn't a question, it's to tell you that how you told about your research was a storytelling, and your intonations were so tender. It just added so much to it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I know it always takes a minute.
Well, while we wait for other questions, I might ask one. Mahalo, Noila, for that beautiful talk, Hiʻilei. I wanted to ask you about something you alluded to early on in the talk, which was that your own experience with repatriation, and that you shared very briefly about the ways in which you experienced early on in your time at Yale, that this was something that came as a surprise, as a responsibility and an obligation that you had to had the privilege to fulfill. And so I was wondering if you could share a little bit about that experience.
Thanks. Yeah. It was so When I came to this project, this really wasn't a story that I was seeking out. It was just kind of one of those things, right? I finished my last book and I didn't know what to write my second book on. And so like I was at a complete loss. And so I thought maybe I would just go to a place that reminded me of my mother and like vibe. And so I went to the Pali because that is the place that makes me think of her. And then I kind of came to getting inklings of this story about the iwi poʻo returning from Cambridge. And I found that I had a connection to Halealoha Aiao. My sister watches his kids sometimes. He was like, oh, you're Hia's sister? She gives really great massages. And I was like, too much. Okay, she does, but okay. And so I engaged in a series of interviews with him. And it was kind of the summer before I was going to move to New Haven and start my job at Yale. And so it had only been maybe a month or so since I had been asking him about these iwi poʻo. And on the first day at my new job, I got an email from a new curator at the Yale Peabody, and she said, hey, do you want to come take a tour of the collections? And I said, yeah, sure, that sounds great. And so I showed up on, my third day at Yale to see the collections, and we passed by the NAGPRA compliance officer in the hallway. And because it was on my mind from doing this work, I said, hey, do you have any iwi in your collections? She said, yeah, as a matter of fact, we do. And I thought, well, I guess we should do something about it now. And she was like, yeah, okay. Well, as it turns out, Yale had repatriated everything like 12 years ago, but somebody had mishandled the collections. And so they had like separated individuals from the, I still don't know how to talk about it anyway, or like what the right words are. So there was a collection of mandibles that had been sitting in this archival box for about 12 years and nobody said anything. So that meant the paperwork was already done. They just needed to be transported back. And so I called Halealoha and I was like, hey, wasn't expecting to be calling you so soon. And he was like, well, obviously they've been waiting for you. They always find you. So I thought, oh my gosh. And then he was like, here are the 8 chants that you need to memorize in 2 weeks. I'll be in Poughkeepsie. See you soon. And so we did it. I got together the Kanaka Maoli undergrads and we memorized the chants and the protocol, and we went to the Peabody and we chanted and we did all of the things, and then we brought them to Vassar for Aiao to take them home. And it was such a strange experience I've never had the experience with researcher work before where things start to insist on your labor in ways that you can't anticipate. And so it's been a really strange and terrifying and affirming experience to move through this project, just because I feel like I'm not in control of where I'm supposed to go at this point. But of course, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, which has really shifted all of my thinking about diaspora, because, if we're not out in the diaspora, nobody brings the mandibles home from the Peabody. Sorry, I digress. Or maybe I stay on topic, but for a long time. I'm so happy to take questions.
Thank you. I'm not sure if I know how to ask this, but just with what the anecdote you were just sharing, and with Aiao feeling the pain, like the fact that you have to bear the brunt of the horror and the pain of the theft and everything for centuries. I don't know what my question is, but is that considered an honor for you and people who are considered the people who bring the mandibles and everything back home, or is there a way to kind of share that burden with people and some of these institutions that are continuing to thrive off the theft?
Yeah, that's a really wonderful question. I haven't figured out how I'm supposed to feel about it, to be honest. Yes, these institutions should bear the full burden of returning things responsibly that they have stolen. And very often also, these institutions don't have any sense of what appropriate handling or comport might be. And I wouldn't want them to be handling my ancestors, which means that we must do it. And it is it's not a task that I had sought out, right? I'm not trained in this kind of work. People train for years and years to do this. But sometimes when no one else is around, you just do the best you can. You try to get it right. And so it does feel like an honor. It's not something that I seek out. But there is something really beautiful about doing it tenderly and doing it right, that I just don't think is possible without us bearing the burden. So it's all of those things, maybe. I've been curious about how institutions like Yale and like Harvard are going to proceed with some of the new terms of NAGPRA that are asking these institutions to move at a quicker clip. What that's going to look like and what kinds of resources will be put towards that. I think that these institutions don't consider it an urgent matter. But just because things have been sitting and waiting for a really long time doesn't mean it's not.
Hey, I'm curious about parks. And I know that parks are things that you think about so much in this talk and your teaching and your research. And I was thinking about the way in which these bones are returned to a park, and how that would have played out differently if it was property that had ownership over it, or what was specific for this story about the park that maybe we really want to think about.
I've really been spending a lot of time thinking about the Constitution of Public Space, right? And within the Constitution of Public Space, there are a number of things that I think happen in Hawaii and a lot of other places that really work on tourism economies, which is that there's a certain degree of public entitlement to the enjoyment of landscape, and that's not an earth-shattering revelation. But there's a way that these sites have to be kind of emptied before they can become a place for everyone. And in a settler colonial landscape, right, it's not for right. If we really want to mince words, right, there's things that we can do to trouble the idea of public space, though I don't think we really like to think negative thoughts about parks because they're considered this really beautiful public good and they're not developed. But of course, parks actually allow really aggressive development to be scaffolded around them. So there's a symbiotic relationship there. In terms of reburial and repatriation in parks and public space, as I was following the story, I was really curious to see how the reburial site would or would not be marked. So when I started talking to Ayau, the Oʻahu, maybe it was going to happen and maybe it wasn't going to happen because they were fundraising and they might not have money for it. And bureaucratic things take forever. And so for a long time, the Ōiwi were just completely unmarked. Their burial site was unmarked in the park, and there was construction webbing around maybe a 4 square foot plot And inside, it just like it looked like it was like protecting an invasive plant or a non-invasive plant. Okay, such that when I interviewed Aiao, I went back up to the park because I was like, he was like, yeah, they're up there, and I was like, well, I was just there. And can you like tell me where they are? And he was like, they're just there. You know, you get out of the car. They're just to the right near the parking lot. And I was like, on the left? He's like, no, on the right. And so I had to go back again. So they were like unmarked to the degree that like, even though I knew that they were there, I had to take a second pass. And there was a moment, right, that year that they were unmarked. It felt kind of lovely to me that they were just going unnoticed, that they were, you know, just able to be back there. And then, so it was a surprise, right, when I happened to be home on a trip, and Aiao called me and he was like, see you tomorrow, you know, wear boots. Okay. And then, you know, we built the Oʻahu, and I haven't been back since we were there for the workshop. And so I haven't gotten to linger in the park and see how people stop or don't stop, or like before that, right? All of the markers there are like World War II stuff. And so you get a lot of veterans who are stopping there maybe like after they go to Pearl Harbor. And then they go and contemplate, I don't know, the securitization of the Pacific. So I'm really curious about how that kind of visitor might internalize what's getting marked. And I thought the language that Aiao got on the plaque was actually like quite spicy.
Yes.
Which is really exciting for me. You know, I'm like, go get him, Aiao.
That last line is stunning.
So good.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
I also love that they were covered by like the fencing that might otherwise be a plant. It makes me think about soil and regrowth, and yeah, it's really lovely.
Yeah.
Other questions?
This is, I guess, pretty simple. I'm curious if you've had a hard time making the case to do this work on, I don't know the right words here, like more than flesh and blood encounters and presences, if you've received any pushback for that or if it's been well received. And I'm just asking this because I know some colleagues who have worked with belief and spirituality have in the past struggled to be able to make space for those kinds of conversations.
Yeah, that's a great question. You know what? I don't know. This is the first time I've given this talk in public. So I guess I'm going to find out. But also I feel really fortunate to be at the point in my career where like I frankly don't care if people think that I'm full of it. Because I'm at the point in my work where like I know what I know, and it's not my job to change my stories to accommodate several centuries of really problematic avenues of inquiry and thought. So yeah, I guess I'll report back maybe. Yeah, thank you.
Mahalo for being with us and for speaking with us. I think like the silence is because we're all reflecting so much on like all of the moʻolelo and ike you shared with us. When you first put up the herb kane painting of the Battle of Nu'uanu at the Pali, it brought up two things for me. I think first was like a memory I have of like being in middle school, Kuku High School, and intermediate school in my Hawaiian history class, and then putting that painting up. And I had remembered sitting with my tutu kane and tutu wahine, and both of them being like, do you guys like count and see how many wahine you see in this photo? So I thought I had seen 3, but there's kind of like a debate between me and my siblings between how many women are depicted in the painting. And I raised my hand in class and I was like, oh, Kumu, like, can we count how many wahine are up there? And I remember like classmates being like, there's no girls up there, like Hawaiian women weren't warriors. I was like, what do you mean? Like they're right there, right? So I've seen this like, I guess, contention around whether or not there are women in that painting or not continue like into my like adulthood.
Yeah.
And so I think like the one that's like so clear to me is like the wahine who's kind of like right like closest to us in the painting on the cliff. Yeah, sure. And so I think that brought up like a second thing of like the presence of wahine koa just throughout Hawaiian history. I think like from like Koʻolau to Mauna Kea to Kuku Wind Turbines, Red Hill, and even Lahaina. Oh yeah, there she is. And there's like some up on the top right, and I think there's like one lady in the middle as well. But yeah, all of these like moments throughout history, from this battle to like the fires that happened in the fall, like we've seen the presence of wahine continue to show up and like be at the front lines of our communities, despite like this I think sometimes like washing over of the presence of Hawaiian women, and so I guess with like all of those things considered, I guess I'm just like wondering how like you encounter this like question. I think Dr. Haunani K. Trask kind of brings up of like Hawaiian nationalism versus like Western feminism. Yeah, so I don't know if that really makes sense, but just like I'm curious on your thoughts on, yeah, perhaps like Dr. Trask's ideologies around nationalism versus feminism, but just encountering Hawaiian women throughout your research.
Yeah, you know, this is like the first, I wrote a little bit about gender in my first book, but I think this is the first project where I've been required to really pay attention to Hawaiian women in the landscape of our world. And of course, you know, I've participate in and follow the movements in which wahine have been on the front lines. Until I started this work, I had actually not noticed the wahine in the Herb Kane painting, so you're more ahead of the curve than I am. But as I've started to pay attention to like what people see in the painting and how people remember the roles of our women in history, it really makes me think about how much like unlearning we as Hawaiians still have yet to do about how we understand the movements of our history, right? So like to see that painting and to think that men were warriors and women were not, like that, like even seeing that and thinking about it as like a fact, a historical fact, is like part and parcel of Western colonization. And I think we also have a lot to untangle about our ideas and our commitments to Hawaiian nationalism. Like even that is really complicated, right? It was a constitutional monarchy modeled in part after the British, right? We had a whole entire forms of governance that were well established before the kingdom era. So when we're thinking about like what we're grieving or what we're longing to return to, we have so many more layers to go through until we're really thinking about what that might look like for us in a way that feels good. Thank you.
Oro, I'm very grateful for your words tonight. And I'm kind of shattered by your presentation in a really beautiful way. So I just wanted
Thanks,
to
Daniel.
thank you. And I did want to ask about grief, because when your comment about, you know, if we're not part of the diaspora, there's no one to bring our relatives home. I don't know what to do with that. I mean, I'm really holding that comment very, very close. And I'm thinking about grief and as part of kinship as something very different from haunting. Mm-hmm. And could you maybe just talk a little bit more about the grief part with repatriation, and how, and I'm also thinking about the comment about, why that labor is ours, but also the importance of that labor being ours. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of a very broad question, but I want to know more about kind of grief and kinship and repatriation and kind of where your thoughts are in that.
Yeah, I'm already afraid that your question will be more beautiful than my answer. But I think that grief is a matter of kinship, or that you can't have kinship without grief. It's just, they're part and parcel. That's part of being in good relation, is to feel with, whether it's love or grief or a whole. We are permitted a whole range and host of emotions, and I want to hang on to that. A lot of the writing of this piece was to help me try to work out exactly like what was going on here and what these experiences were. And so I said it in the talk, but it felt like a revelation to me at the time, where I was like, why do we need to parrot back the language of horror all the time? Like, maybe we don't have to give them that with our dead. Like, it's not horrible to be walking amongst your dead. It's beautiful. Like, what I would give to be in my homeland surrounded by the ghosts of my kin. You don't realize how nice it is until you don't have it, and then you miss it. But, so I don't think I knew that. And then the stuff went down with the Ōiwi at Yale. And what struck me at the time was that my dead are here. I am with them here. And they're waiting for me. And that shifted a whole bunch of things about what I didn't know, or what I didn't understand about what it meant to be an East Coast Kanaka Maoli, right? The first time somebody called me diasporic, I could have just crumbled. I was like, oh my God, I'm in the diaspora. But now that I've been here for a while, I have started to come to see that we need to be everywhere. I would like to be home, but maybe that's just not my role right now. My role right now is to help train the Hawaiians that I'm working with here. My role is to speak our stories. My role is to make kin. And I don't know. So that's not an answer, but that's where I'm at. Thank you.
Mahalo nui for coming and speaking with us today. Sort of related to what you were just talking about, as a professor at Yale, and I guess as college students at Harvard, what is your personal approach to the balance of participating in and working within structures of Western academia and balancing that with traditional knowledge and what that dynamic?
Yeah. I think that, I think one of the things that I've always had to be really honest with myself about is that I'm not a cultural practitioner. I'm just not. I can't dance hula for the life of me. My mother was a beautiful dancer. My sister's a gorgeous dancer. It was just not, not for Hiʻilei. Okay. And I, all of these kinds of things I've had to learn as an adult. And, as a baby of the 80s, right, we came up at a very different time in political consciousness of Hawaiians. Some folks were fortunate enough to be in these deep pockets of cultural upbringing. And then a bunch of us were just raised by super Americanized Hawaiian parents. And that's okay. Like, I always wonder, like, what my mother would kind of make of the work that I'm doing. Like, would she be there with me, or would she be, like, deeply uncomfortable about what I have to say about the U.S. state? I don't know. So for me, I haven't had necessarily that kind of like a whiplash. I mean, there's definitely like culture shock, right? I'm sure you all experienced it. You got here and you're like, where am I? I need to put a Hawaiian flag up in my dorm room because I don't, I have to like figure out my identity all over again. Sorry, that's what I did. I'm projecting. Okay. So for me, it's actually been an experience of like slow learning. And a slow, like, reorientation back towards home for me. And I used to be really worried about like what that meant for my identity and and then like the older you get, right, the more you're like, well, this can just be a really long process. And like whoever I am right now is okay. And, I take my language classes, I take 101 and 102 over and over again. Because it's really hard to learn ʻōlelo Hawaiʻi when you have no one to talk to. And, I go and I translate my new pepa and I do all of those things and I build networks with other Kanaka that are out here. And I am happy to be at a point where I'm just like fully embracing like the slow burn of what that is and what it feels like. And I want to make room for more of us that are like that. Thank you.
Well, I think that's a beautiful place to close. We just want to thank you. Thank you for making the trip. Thank you for being with us. Thanks for your brilliance and all of the questions and ponderings that you've left us with.
Oh, I'm so profoundly grateful. Thank you, everyone. I know this was a long night on a busy week, so thanks for coming.